Das Vav El that made a long shir, and then the last shir, weiter, Chayel is weiter very, very long shir because these are special days. Says the Rebbe, however, even though I just told you, says the Alter Rebbe, that the person's mahus, the person's mitzvah, the person's guf is a much of a lakus, don't get excited. Tzarech lahagdim, I have to give you agdam, mashamatim meiri alav shalom, I heard my Rebbe from the Mizit Shemagi. That says al pasuk in the pasuk. V'enechi offer ve'efer she'omar Avram Avinu olav shalom, that Avram Avinu said. Avram Avinu said, v'enechi offer ve'efer. I am earth and ash. How does Rashi translate v'enechi offer ve'efer? I am offer, ayedei dalad malachim, and I am efer, ayedei nimrid. Nimrid wanted to burn me, dalad malachim wanted to kill me, and the Eibishter made nisim and I survived. But there is a maggid of a pnimius diklapshat. Avram is saying, "V'noichi, I, as you see me in this world, I'm ash and earth from the way I myself am in other me'elyin and atzilus." Okay, al ha'ares nishmasei ha'meira beguf, the light of the neshama of Avram Avinu which radiates and fills his body. That of course it comes me'er chesed elyon from the light of the supernal chesed. V'hi midas, because that's the midah of Avram Avinu which is chesed. Midas ahava rabba, the measure of infinite love. Shabbat Haya, which was inside of him through which he loved. Shahaya Es HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we love the Eibush to Ava Gedei Lev Al Yenin Kol Kach, a great and supernal love to such an extent. Ache Nasa Merkava La Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's charged for the Eibush. Now I must say that the Lashon Ava Rabba is Tzarech Yim Gadol, because Bepashtas the Madrega of Avram Avinu is Ava Selim. Ava Rabba is Arana. This is the Chasidus, the difference between Aaron and Avraham is Ava Selim, and Aaron Aken is Ava Rabba. The Alter Rebbe says that even Aaron Avram Avinu Lagabe Yosef is even Ava Rabba. V'salke Daita Chamina, you would think that Avram Avinu was a Merkava for Chassid Atzilus, because he loved Eibishter so much. And by the way, there's a Bavus, the Sefer Aboy that Chassidus brings that supports this idea. Right? The Sefer Aboy says that Omra Midas HaChesed Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Midas HaChesed, that's the Eibishter, that from the time you created Avram Avinu, I'm pushed out of a job. Shu Eimid the Meshamash B'mkeimi. Midas HaChesed of Atzilus, that's the Eibush that Avram Avinu took me over. That's the Pshat HaMerkava. He physically was a physical human being that was a manifestation of Chachma Atzilus. So V'sal Kedai Dechamina, you would think Shebachin As Chesed V'Ava Shalom Ma'ala was Yerusal Yenes, that the same way this Chesed and the Ava exists in Esesphiris of Atzilus, Himi'ein V'Sog is similar to, and are the same category of Mahus Midas Avarab Shalom Avinu Alav Shalom, of the essence of the measure of infinite love that Avram Avinu had. Rak, you would only think Shigedei Levin Iflam Imeno, that it's greater, more wonders in it, and Taka Lamai Lamai and Ketz V'Tachas, higher and higher beyond the end, beyond the purpose. Kineid, as it is known, that Mimidus Al Yenes, that the essence Firis of Atzilus She'ein Lem Ketz V'Tachas, that have no end and conclusion and purpose, B'Tad Atzman by themselves. Ke'edin Sei Baruch Hu Meir Melubush V'Techa Mamash, the infinite light of Hashem is revealed and manifest in them. And therefore, the midas of Atzilus are obligable. The midas of Atzilus are obligable. As opposed to a neshama in a guf, there's an end and a limit to the midas. So you would think like this: Hey, Avram Avinu is midas chesed Atzilus. Chesed Atzilus is ein sof. The mid itself may be mugbal, but the oida is ein sof, and as well the midas ein sof. Avram Avinu is a physical person. You have to assume that his midah is limited. However, you could still think that it's basically the same thing, and you know what the word basically means. Pseudo-intellectualism. That the midas of Avram Avinu, as compared to the midas of Atzilus, it's similar to, in the same category, the supernal midas. Tak Atzilus is bligvul, ein sof, and Avram Avinu is mugbal, but it's the same category, same echos. Sagt Avram Avinu name. Avram Avinu says, I am earth and ash. In other words, not only am I much less than my midah, and Atzilus, it's b'chalal, a different quality, a whole different echos. And he explains. He's a very interesting mashal. Think about ash. What's ash? It's the essence of a piece of wood, right? The English word, the correct word is carbon. A piece of wood, as is any organic thing, is made up mostly from a substance, from a chemical, called carbon. The carbon is mixed together with other things, otherwise it's not raw carbon, it's a piece of wood. There's an potato, it has a little wind, a little water, and a little fire, with a lot of earth, right? Hanisaf, that when it's burnt, Before it was burned, it was made up of 4 elements: fire, wind, water, earth. Right? But it was mostly earth. And the fire, the wind, and the water are much less. Now, V'gimel, you say this emer, the 3 elements, emer, eish, mayim, ruach, fire, water, wind, chol, v'vahol, cholahem, have passed on and gone off. V'kol, when we're consumed and lost, v'ashan, hamishava, meharkavas, ashan, in this smoke, in the steam. Hamishava, meharkavas, which is created from the composition of fire, wind, and water. Kineda, there is no. So when you burn a piece of wood, the fire, wind, water, and the glue that brings the fire, wind, water together disappears. However, we say that down, the 4th element, Jehi, Shahaya Be'et, which was in the piece of wood, Jehu offer, which is the earth, Shabei, which is inside of itself, Hayered Lamata, which falls down here, and Lecha'eda, most of the wood was carbon, most of the wood was that, the Ein Ha'eshe, let us by the fire, does not consume it, Hu Hanishar Kai, when it remains. B'hu, which is the ash. So you have a piece of wood, which is in kamus, mostly earth, mostly ash. A little bit is fire, a little wind, a little water. Now you burn it. So the other 3 elements depart, and what's left is aphir, is earth. So you would think that the ash of a piece of wood should be almost as large as the original piece of wood, because the fire, the wind, and the water were not that much of the volume of the kamus of the piece of wood. They were only a small percentage. What happens, Lepeil? Burn a piece of wood, what happens? Look at Azay. Mihine. Kol Mahusa Eitz, the entire reality of this piece of wood, Umamoshay, and its substance, V'chaimini, and its material, it's being physical. V'tzuras, as well as its shape. In other words, its volume, the amount of area it takes up. V'eda v'recha v'evi, in length and width and depth. Shayinir al-ayin, which we were able to see, Koidem Shenisaf, prior to being burned. Says the Alter Rebbe, it's about 9 lines from the bottom of 242. Ikrei Hayyami, it said the Ofar Shabbat. It was predominantly earth. The fire, wind, and water are really adding only tzura, the Ruchnias Shabbat. Right? Rakshe Emer Klulim, it had also a little fire, water, and wind inside. Ki ha'afer u'chumri yetzim b'kulim, earth or carbon is the most material, the most physical of all of the elements. And of all 4 elements, v'yesh lei, eidach v'recha v'evi, each of all others has denseness, has volume, has length, width, and breadth. Fire and wind is v'chal ruchnius. V'gam ha'mayim, and even moisture, which is yes substantive, does take up space. Heimat mizberbeit is a small percentage of the wood. And everybody understands that all of the volume, in other words, most of what this piece of wood took up in terms of space, was all the earth. And now that you're burning it, it's returning to earth. And what is the earth? It's the ash which remains after you separate from it fire, water, and wind. So now, a piece of wood, you burn it of ash. The ash should be lefi erech, it should be proportional to the size of the wood, and that is not the case. A massive piece of wood produces a small handful of earth, of ash. V'hine, when you look at what ash remains after the fire, ein lo dimyin ve'erech, has no comparison whatsoever, el mahus ha'etz ha'gadol, to the original large piece of wood, be'erech v'recha ve'evi, to all of its volume and length, breadth, and depth, kedem shenisah, prior to its being burnt. Leibe kamusay, not in its quantity, that means in its volume and in its mass. V'leibe echuzay, not in its quality, that means in its usefulness and it's being alive. After humuhusay vatzmusay, though the ash is the very same substance as the original piece of wood, umimen is have, and the ash comes from the piece of wood, yet when you burn it, the ash that emerges is completely in a different realm than the piece of wood of which the ash is really constituted. That's the motion. So if Rambam says, I'm earth and ash, he doesn't mean I should have been burnt. He means my chesed, compared to my own chesed, there is an atzilus, is like ash from a piece of wood. That's the moshel of neichav avayv. Think about this. Kach aderech moshel nenimshel. Omar Avram Avinu alav shalom al midah say. Avram Avinu spoken about his midah, which is midah zachesed v'ha'av v'ham'ira bey, the midah of kindness and love from atzilus, which is radiating in him, umelubashet and is revealed begufa in his body, and he represents chesed of ein sof, chesed of atzilus. The Av Shehi Midas Ava v'Chesed Elin Shabatilas. Though Avraham Avinu's Chesed is the very same Av and Chesed, love and kindness, which is supernal in Atzilus. Hamei Ibn Ishmael, which shines into his neshama. Shaisa Merkava Al which is the chariot felakos. Avraham Avinu physically was a Merkava Atzilus. Though Dal Treba Afal Pikein. Avraham Avinu, though he represents Chesed of Atzilus in this world, still Berid Talamat. When it descends below the savage Gufa to come into his body. His tal shall say elements of the chain reaction of worlds. From step to step. To the many contractions. You should know that Avraham Avinu down here is relative to Chesed Atzilus, like a little bit of ash to a piece of wood. There's no comparison in measure of the quality of the light of love. Hameir Bey, which is filling the physical person of Avraham Avinu, to the quality of the light of love and supernal kindness, Shabbatilus, which is in Atzilus. Although it's the same thing, here it's in Atzilus, here it's in Avraham Avinu, still it's incomparable. And what is the measure of incomparability? It's relative to the comparison of a dimyan, relative and compared to Mahus Ha'afa, the essence of ash, of earth. Shenasa Efa, which becomes ash, El Mahusei Vechusei, to its own essence and quality, when it was a piece of wood which is pleasant to look at and tasty to eat. In other words, it's not only a chilik in kam, it's a chilik in echos. The physical piece of wood is shalei be'erech, the ash, Avraham Avinu's chesed. And the same is true of all the esesphiris, it's shalei be'erech, that's firis of Atzilus. So we're going to use a person for a mashal to explain esesphiris, like we said in yesterday's shir. That means today, Yidaldo, Mepsari Achzalaka, and so forth. But don't get carried away. Nothing compares to Atzilus. The Yesim is there, and the distance is much greater. La'avdol ba'alof ma'avdol, separating thousands of separations. The Torah speaks the language of man using an analog and a creative choice of words to help us understand it a little bit. So we're about to explain Esesphiris, and it's a very good explanation, but don't get carried away with the explanation. Okay?